All right, guys. So we're going to sketch in Krita for a little bit. Some of you wanted more concept design videos. I figure we'll just play around in 2D for the time being because I had ran into some Windows update issues, which left me really frustrated and don't really trust my system right now. Plus, there's all kinds of drama in the news, whether it's age verification stuff or the Iran war and all that. So it's very distracting, and I haven't been thinking about creating YouTube videos very much. But I wanted to talk about some of this 2D stuff because I think it's still relatively important that we go over some of this concept design idea. And really what it comes down to is that design, when you're designing something, it's about creating a thing and not doing art necessarily. And that's really something you got to separate in your head to some degree, that you're just trying to use art techniques possibly to create a thing, but you're not creating art necessarily. So it's kind of the wrong impression that a lot of guys get with it. There's two types of art, maybe. There's like commercial art, and there's more like fine art, where fine art tends to be more like artist centric, and commercial art tends to be more about just creating a thing for potentially a thing, right? Like a video game or a movie or something like that. So when we're in a program like Krita or Photoshop or whatever, there's some interesting like ways of working with this software that I kind of just wanted to talk about that could be quite useful to you. Now, I made this video some time ago just talking about loose sketching or doing a sketching study where we kind of made a skull and played around with that idea. So I'm a big proponent of just like using a very, like a pressure sensitive opacity and flow brush that's either hard round or soft round, and just learning to sketch and doodle with it, and using it at various sizes and trying to play with shading and stuff like that, which can be quite fun. Unfortunately, though, this doesn't always work out very well. It's very loose, and you kind of a lot of times want to go through and make things a little bit more crisp and clear, and maybe more eligible and stuff like that. So I want to show you something kind of interesting that happens here, because you might assume that you could use like hard round brushes. And if you've seen guys doing this in videos in the past, certainly you can create artwork with a hard round brush. There's nothing wrong with it, but just, trying to sketch and doodle with it, it's not very, very good for it. Normally you can see it's pretty rough unless you were to go through and very purposefully like place out edges. And even then your hand's probably a little bit rocky and stuff like that. But so what I like to do is basically when I'm using these other brushes, something like a pencil or whatever, it feels much more, much more smooth and better to sketch with, right? Whereas a hard round doesn't. But it's actually kind of an illusion in your brain that's actually occurring here. So if you were to drop the opacity on the layer and you use that hard round brush again, you'd be surprised that even though, the pressure sensitive opacity is real nice, it's actually just the opacity being lower and not using pure black that's probably messing with you. So this is a lot more fun to kind of get in and start getting messy with a little bit now. And so normally I would say you create a new layer, you increase your opacity, and you turn on some brush smoothing, maybe use like a dynamic brush tool, and you can get in here and you can ink this thing up now. And this is a pretty common workflow, believe it or not, for a lot of concept artists, character artists, you name it. They will do these little bit rougher sketches. Sometimes they're still pretty clean, but then they go back and they start inking it more or less. And they might use like a size, whatever, pixel brush, and then they'll use another size that's a little bit smaller, maybe not that small. And what they'll do is they'll just go through and they will do the interior edges or shapes with a little bit smaller of a line weight. And they're not doing anything much more than this. Usually it's something very simple like this. And they end up with like really nice looking concept sketches. And as a result of that, once you do this, what you can do is you can go through and you can possibly, a lot of artists will probably end up doing a layer below it and going back and either doing like a clown map or base colors or something like that. And they start filling all this in behind it. Now there's always like possibility to use a fill bucket, grow it by one. You could just fill them too if you're just wanting to move super fast, but it does kind of mess up your lines to some degree. So it's one of those things there where, you can play around with these different ideas perhaps. And you can just come up with stuff very quickly, and it's a lot of fun anyways. So you can come up with some really graphic, flat shaded looking stuff. If you wanted to go back and do more proper cell shading, of course you could do that. But that's kind of the idea, right? Like just being able to sketch and draw and do things. They're just tools. And ultimately, when you're working this way, and a lot of you guys, there's a number of you guys that probably ran into this situation where in a lot of my videos anyways, I say like draw things from the side orthographic view. Now there's a little bit of a problem with this, is that it wasn't entirely true what I was saying, because if you drew a cylinder from the side and it's perfect flat, no, there's no perspective, it's going to look like a cylinder will look like a rectangle, right? And so what you're really wanting to do is probably more like one vanishing point, right? So 1 point perspective. And in that case, a cylinder would look more like this, and you would end up with, well, not a rectangle, it's just slightly bent on the shape there on the ends anyways. And so this gives you a better control over what's occurring with the design, because you can have glancing angles now, just slight glancing angles to things. If you're doing 1 point, you can kind of see a little bit of the front here and maybe a little bit of the back or the front or something like that. So little things like that can be quite important. So like 1 point vanishing point, it's not always in the center. Sometimes it can be out to the side. Everything kind of goes to that. And this is a pretty common art technique that a lot of you probably didn't even realize was being utilized in a lot of sketches and drawings and things like that. Very common to see 1 points for concept. So that is something you want to practice and study. And along with 2 point and isometric, I think is really useful. Keep those in the top of your head. You're going to use those techniques to actually make things happen and occur in the 2D realm of things. Now, of course, there's always 3D concept design, which is, a whole nother ballpark to some degree. But the reason why a lot of you guys are going to be suffering when it comes to coming up with like cool, interesting shapes or forms or designs is because you got to really focus on those design fundamentals comboed together with some of these art fundamentals, such as perspective drawing. And then ultimately, you can end up starting to create really cool things. Plus, you want to use references and always understand that there's a balance between realism and abstractness, right? So like you can work kind of abstract at first and then bring in some different elements to a design, whether it's a weapon or a building or whatever. And then you can add those features into that abstract shape or form and start to make it become more of a reality, to something that's more believable anyways, that might be useful in a game and whatnot. But those fundamentals are key. So just understanding how to create compound shapes, doing shape breakups, how to create interesting compositions and balance and hierarchy and patterns, rhythms, flows, white space, and all of that. It starts to add up. And when you're creating something that's very, like we got a bunch of rectangles going on here, this is great, but it's really about the balance of things and like how you're doing that. Like they can be unbalanced, that's fine, but you can try to figure out like, your proportions, like how this is broken up, like its main areas, like large with a smaller shape. And this is the kind of thing you have to practice with, because if I'm doing something that's very polygonal and I know I can round any of these edges, and I can actually round all of these edges, and I end up with a more organic kind of shape going on here, right? And so this is something you got to know about. Like you can do these things, and you can also do the corners, obviously. So if you're going to make another polygonal shape, you can round certain corners, and you can round them at different ratios, like large ones and small ones. So you only got like the squared corners, the fillet or beveled corners, or fillets or bevels or round corners, whatever you want to call them, and chamfered ones as well, right? So these become edges as well. And that's kind of the trick here, because one of those design fundamentals is shape variation. And you have to start learning how to, create variation. And it's not just variation of shape as you would think of it. Shape variation includes variation of edges and variation of surfaces. So if we had a very smooth, organic, curvy surface here, and we start chopping things off and just turning them flat here, this is going to be a shape variation. So you can think of surface variation as well, right? Planar surfaces and then curved surfaces, super useful. So like if we come into a design like this and we flatten this whole area out, this might look more interesting because of that. And you have to find a way to balance all of that across the surfaces that you're creating and include that functionality. And then suddenly that's how you start creating designs. It's confusing at first, right? Because these are terms you probably never really heard before or messed with. And these ideas, it's not something that you've practiced a lot. And you can't watch another YouTube video to get better at this. You have to actually get in there and start doing it. And one of the best ways to actually start doing it is by taking a real world thing, whatever it is, it doesn't matter if it's a weapon, a vehicle, or whatever the case, and start trying to find ways to create things that make it better, right? Like, or change the way the style looks. You know, you can just draw over them, Photoshop on top of them, or just model the base model and then go back and try to add additional elements to make it more interesting looking, things like that. And that's really where you're going to start learning the most. You can see if I start working that to a 1 point here, it's kind of more interesting, perhaps, right? Maybe a little bit. And so this is what you got to start doing. You got to get into these programs, and 2D programs with a graphics tablet, being able to draw it, super useful. You can do some things so fast in 2D, it's insane. And something that you sketch in like 30 seconds to model it out in Blender might take you like a couple hours. And that's kind of the craziest part about it. But the flip side of that, some things are easier to do inside of Blender, especially if you're reaching like high levels of complexity. Like there's a reason kit bashing exists, or maybe you're doing like whole cityscapes. It's much faster to model your city than and even add textures to it than it is to try to sketch out a whole city in like 1 point perspective or whatever, and keep all these edges in alignment and whatnot. I'm not saying it's not impossible to do, but it's not just going to, it's going to be a lot faster. It's going to look higher fidelity if you did it in 3D possibly, right? Than trying to do it all by hand necessarily. If you just do line art sketches, I mean, you can still sketch out some pretty cool stuff, but it's just not going to be enough detail in it possibly. And it's going to kind of just go haywards anyways. So what I want to do here is just kind of show you a couple of tricks though, because like I was saying in the beginning, like I'm a huge fan of just sketching loose and light. If I took this opacity and just dropped it a little bit here, and I just kind of sketch as light as I possibly can, there's a really cool thing about this that you probably didn't realize can occur or happen, but this is a soft round brush, okay? This is a modified pencil. It's just soft round. I took the scattering off of it pretty much. And, but we can sketch and doodle in here. And if I sketch something very light and I like it and I go back, I can turn brush smoothing on, right? And I could turn the pressure sensitivity off if I wanted to, or I could just go back in here and I could kind of like reconfirm all of these edges. So this is a way you would work traditionally anyways, where you do a very light sketch and you kind of go back over it until you find those designs that you like, or those edges. They're oftentimes known as like seeking edges. And you go back and you kind of just reconfirm them. And that way you can take the eraser later on and you can erase all those little lines, right? And nobody would know that you did all these seeking lines. If you did them light enough, they should erase fairly easily. So it's kind of a fun way of working. So you can do a bunch of like exploratory stuff, even traditionally, and not worry about having a Control-Z button, basically, is what I'm getting at. That eraser will act like, well, a Control-Z button. So there's lots of ways of cheating that traditional art. And so if we mimic that kind of workflow over here for just a moment, what we're going to find is that we could go through this whole thing and just come up with all kinds of crazy cool little alignments and shapes and things like that, and layer them and whatever else. But, you know, brush smoothing's very helpful in digital. And you'll see a lot of videos, they say like, you know, don't use brush smoothing, or don't do this, or don't do it. Okay. Use any tool underneath the sun if you want for digital. See, I keep missing my starting point for some reason. But use any tool that you have available. This is digital. This is not traditional. We have our own tool sets, and some of them just make life easier than others. But basically, you know, this is just one sketch, one drawing. Like, how do we get rid of all of this? And some of you might assume, you know, you use an eraser and you go in and you start erasing. You don't have to necessarily. There's always been tricks in digital. So if I do a new layer, I'm going to fill it with white. Okay. Well, let's try it again. Why is it not filling? What's going on here? Because we got the eraser selected with the fill bucket? Okay. All right. I guess that's what happens then. There's always some weird thing in Krita that happens sometimes. So new layer, I fill it with white. We put it underneath the drawing. All right. And we're going to get something like this going now. So here's the thing about this, like drawing, fill, we're not going to mess with the background. We're going to Control-E these down. So they're all combined together. If let me take that background real quick, and we will let's change that to like something dark gray or something, so we can tell what's white and what's dark, the background. All right, so we have this going on here. If we had scanned a sketch we did on paper into a computer, right, with your scanner, and we brought it into Krita, we would have something like this going on. It might be even a little bit rougher than this, obviously, depending on how you sketched it, but it'd be similar-esque. And so this was always a thing that you would run into when scanning artworks. And this is the way I got started with Photoshop anyways, is I would bring sketches in via scanner, and I'd come in here and line them up and clean them up and make them look nice. And one of those cool tricks was that you can adjust the levels. And so even though this was done with a soft round brush, you can see it's very soft. We got these background kind of background lines anyways. And whoops, not that. What is that? That is the wrong one. Let's do levels. Okay. Now, so the easiest, cheapest trick to this was to pull the bright handle here in levels and just bring it down instantly, right? Like it cleans that out basically, which is really cool. But we can also increase the contrast by squeezing them together. So I can actually make this a hard round brush, and I can also balance out how soft it is by pulling that back further, which is kind of cool. It's kind of a interesting little technique anyways, that you can do that. So you can bring those back by accident. And if we really wanted to, we could play with the midpoint as well, just to see if we can get some different results out of that. And so you can find a lot of use for this is what I'm trying to point out here. Really cool little trick, I think, for this specific tool anyways, or for sketches that you might scan in, and maybe even sketch here in digital and accidentally did it on the background or whatever. I think we'll pull that back down just a little bit more. All right, so ultimately, a lot of times for like hard surface things, the goal is to create nice clean line art. Obviously, I went through this really fast, so it's not like great, but and eventually you start doing the fills and everything. If you can fill bucket it, that would be great. But you can see got a little bit of an issue with that. And so there's a little hidden feature. Well, maybe it's not really hidden. It's right here, actually. It's the Colorize Mask tool. It's the auto color tool for Krita. And it's actually kind of interesting. You click it, right? And then it needs to create over here. So all you do is click in the middle. You get this little icon here, but that's the same as toggling on edit overlay or edit keystrokes. Okay, that little button way over here. So basically what we can do is we can come in and we can mark like blue. Maybe we do a different blue here. Let's delete that one. Remove it. We'll do a different blue. Unfortunately, I don't know if you can change the colors of those after you've started, but we can start doing this number basically where we try different colors, and it'll auto color basically is all we're getting at here. So, and then we do a little bit of a darker gray here and here and here. We can do like lime green. I like using lime green for transparency. Okay. So all on the outside here, we're going to do transparent. And so we select the green and click transparent. Boom, it puts a cross line through it. There we go. Now we can update it, see what it does. It might take a little while to update depending on the canvas size and how much complexity you got going on. But it should give us a little bit of a preview here, and voila, look at that. So this is one of the only tools in Krita that I know of where you can do fills, and even if your lines weren't completely touching each other, it will still try to figure out what's going on here and fill it anyways. And so what we can do with this now is like, once we're done with this, we can turn that edit keystrokes off, and it'll just be the regular setup here now. So it's the same as hitting that little icon way over here. See, that's what I was talking about. Anyways, so that's just a way of doing a quick fill. So if you ever want to just go through and do like a loose sketch, just keep in mind, go as light as you possibly can and like reconfirm the lines that you want to confirm. You can eventually, just hit them with a little bit of that levels adjustment, and then hit it with this colorized mask, man. And you got like instantaneous stuff here going on basically. Now, why it decided to turn white, although I thought I told it to turn transparent, I'm not real sure. So it's there's some things in here that might be still somewhat questionable, perhaps, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, you should be able to take this and let's see if it does. Usually you can flatten layers, or there's some option here. Yeah, flatten a layer up here. Okay. And then now it's back to like this. You lose your mask setup But you could go to colors, color to alpha. You can get rid of all the white perhaps. And you can see it actually didn't quite work out the way I was anticipating it there. Maybe you can adjust the threshold a little bit and get some different results out of it. But basically, yeah, you should get rid of all the white. This usually works better for line art, not necessarily this, because it's probably transparent right now. So if I made the background green real quick, there's a good odd chance, yeah, that starts to turn green because it's transparent. Another thing we could do, if it does start doing that, whenever you have transparent pixels, if you hit Shift D on a layer, or excuse me, I changed it to Shift D, it's Control J by default. If we Control J and start duplicating it, and Control E it back together, it should start to fill those transparent pixels. It might not be the right color anymore, but you can do things like that as well. So it might shift, like depending on how transparent it is and what you did with it, it might just shift quite a bit. So there's a lot of little tricks all over in Krita, and sometimes it's hard to get them right the first time, the first go around, but it can happen. So like this one, I can't do a grow no more because it's too thin. I could try anti-aliasing and see what I get. Might turn out a little bit nicer. Might be able to walk it back to where it was a little bit, somewhat anyways. So this is usually why leaving your lines separate from your fills is more useful. But if you're ever in a rush, I guess you could just use that fill layer or colorize mask tool, and you'll just get a nice, flat shaded object, generally speaking. And you should be good to go on it. And then, so if you do things like that, of course, Control Shift G it, you can always go back and start shading things and actually adding lighting effects and all that other fun stuff. So a lot of times you might do like a multiply and do this general shading across it just with like black and an eraser, right? So I hit erase, which works for the most part, but you'll probably do another layer that's set to maybe like, you could do like color dodge maybe and use white and start to lighten other areas perhaps. This is pretty common strategy or technique as well. And if you wanted those lines separate, obviously you would do things on different layers. But so you'll do like a shadow pass or like general shading, like ambient occlusion type of pass. And then you'll do a highlight pass possibly. And then you move on from there. Like you can do textures and layer things crazy like if you want. I mean, there's all kinds of ways of working with digital, but you can certainly take your time and do the shading and get all kinds of different results out of it. There's tons of different setups for this. There's different strategies guys use. But the ones I typically like the most are kind of like you do your fill, right? Maybe maybe you have like lines at the top. You might have your fill at the bottom. It might be like kind of like a base color fill, and then flat shaded, basically what we did. And then you can do like shading or like your basic shadow pass or shading pass. Not like hard shadows yet. If you're going to do hard shadows, you can do those a little bit later on, perhaps on another layer. But and then so like general shading and general highlights, and then you can go back and do any kind of detail work on a paint over on top of it or whatever. A lot of little tricks like that, and so you can just have a lot of fun with it. It's not really that hard to do. And what I'm showing you here is not entirely like the best way of doing everything, but it's just some food for thought. Having control over this is super, super important though. Like being able to understand the rendering methods, the sketching methods, like how to sketch in perspective, all of that, super, super important for coming up with 2D concept, especially if you're trying to make it look really, really nice. And then what you're going to eventually do is you have to learn this and you have to study this to some degree, like maybe not be like the best person at it ever. But you'll find that if you do just enough with it for a little while, you'll start seeing the possibility of like cramming in other aspects from 3D. So basically what we're doing is we're starting this idea of creating compositions on like a single shape or a single design. And this layer setup is just for this, right? There's one thing that we've created. So when we're creating a whole concept piece, we can have multiple things doing this all over the scene. And that's kind of the trick, right? Well, some of those things might be made in 3D and rendered out. And then you're coming back over here and adding additional shading, lighting, texture work, or whatever. and you have to drop it into the image as well, right? Now, what we're creating over here as well, if we're doing illustrations or just art pieces, we can use in 3D. So there's nothing that stops us from taking this from Krita, going into Blender and using it as like backdrops or elements within a composite or something, and vice versa. It goes back and forth in both directions. So concept design is a lot more involved than just being able to sketch and draw and understanding art fundamentals, design fundamentals. It's way more than that. It's the tools that you have available too, right? Like there's Blender. There's possibly like, what if you had to do things in motion, right? You can do some things in motion in Blender. Sure, that's possible. There's also other programs like After Effects. Then that starts opening you up to this idea of compositing with motion, Blender and After Effects, right? Or DaVinci and things like that. That's where things kind of go crazy, because at some certain point you realize that the VFX workflow and animation in general, like what you're doing in Blender and After Effects and everything, is basically the same thing you do in 2D with concept art. They're very similar anyways. The whole idea of constructing animations in Blender, even, they kind of go back to that idea of creating composites the way Disney used to back in its old like 50s or 60s cartoons or whatever, where they started putting, I forgot the name of that film they used. It was like a clear film, and they would do composites by ripping the image apart. Well, they would paint the image on the film in different layers. Okay, physical pieces of clear film they would paint on, right? And then it'd set the camera up on top of it, and that's how they would create parallax effects. Well, you do that in Blender today, still. I mean, you can create a 3D scene and you can still create parallax effects with just transparent images. So, and there's even animations out there right now that do that. As for like, there's a lot of guys that are creating like videos for musicians and things like that. And they're doing things like this all the time. And it's all connected, 100% connected. And really, the most disconnected thing from all of this to some degree is video games. And that's why video games tend to be some of the hardest 3D projects to work on, because you're talking about making interactive 3D environments, which is not the same as just creating a film, right? Where you're using all these kind of film techniques, if you would. All of this was derived basically from, back in the day. A lot of this like digital stuff here is not only just traditional artwork necessarily, like that's derived from like oil painting or acrylic painting. It's also derived from, well, film and cartoons and things like that. So animation in general. Matter of fact, Krita itself is an animation software. I don't know if all of you guys realize this, but you got animation timelines, and you can do this stuff here. So if you wanted to create film here or animation here inside of Krita, you can. It's one of those crazy things about it. And same is true with Photoshop. They have a basic keyframe system there as well. So it's a rather interesting realization that like digital art, whether it's, film, photography, 3D modeling, drawing, sketching, they all rely off the same fundamentals for the most part. And they have very similar concepts and workflow. And it's something you got to practice, right? And you got to realize real quick and early on that if you're learning like one discipline, like you're just trying to learn to create game models, that's great. But there's a lot more to creating a game than just creating game models, right? If you're doing environment art, and especially if you're trying to like do indie projects. So like environment art might be like one way of doing things, characters one way, right? But you still got to do like splash screens or sizzle reels or like commercials and things like that potentially with the projects, so that you can build up some hype for them, at least in the marketing and stuff too. And so, that's why a lot of studios like outsource jobs like that, or they have special teams for it at least. So ultimately, we didn't talk much about concept design itself, because we'll save that for more later on in another video, I think, where I'll probably have to time lapse some things and being put together in both 2D and 3D. I think it'll make more sense, but it's really just about proportion, hierarchy, planar level changes, changing shapes over and over and over again. And then the rest of this stuff that looks like art, it's technically it's art, but it's more commercial art, not fine art. And you know, unless you're just doing it for personal reasons. But it's just a tool at the end of the day. They're techniques, they're tools, and that's all it really comes down to. So if you don't learn, it's kind of like trying to do like advanced physics, mathematics, you know, but you don't learn addition and subtraction first, you're going to have a hard time moving on. So the basic ideas of creating 3D models, the basic idea of doing composites and sketching and drawing and creating shapes and lighting effects on surfaces and things like that. Super important because, you know, learning to render here is the same idea of like creating proper PBR materials to some degree. When you're looking at your reference images, you're looking for the things you would look for as an artist, right? Like you're looking for that reflective surface and how big the shine is across the surface. And it's going to tell you how glossy the surface is potentially. You see where I'm going with that? And we can also see like the lighting of the environment and how it affects an object. So we can actually recreate the lighting of any kind of picture that we see if we can just analyze the photo well enough, right? So those are the kinds of things that we start looking for, because a lot of times, especially with like photography, all surfaces are like geometric forms, right? And it can have like these notional grids going across it. And this is the key to everything, because this is your more or less kind of the same idea as topology. Very similar to topology when subdivision modeling. And that's the same kind of grid you rely off of when you're trying to add reflections of environments into a surface of an object that you're trying to create a render of. And render, I mean, by render, I mean render in 2D. So like we would add a photo in here and contort it in all kinds of ways to get a photorealistic result. To make that look real, we have to know how that grid would be functioning on the surface. A lot of artists, they see this when they look at form, right? They don't draw it on the form once they get to a certain point. Because when you're learning to do construction at the very, start of doing perspective drawings, you're creating wireframes more or less, And if you're creating wireframes in 2D, right? Those should line up, which it's not really doing. But if you're creating wireframes in 2D, you think you're going to have a better time looking at wireframes in 3D? Possibly. I mean, it's not guaranteed. Everybody's unique, but that's the idea. Like, if you can construct a wireframe and understand that you can draw in 3D, you can create 3D, the idea of something in 3D at least, in 2D just as efficiently, or if not more efficiently than you would in Blender, because you're not messing with vertices this whole time, right? Especially if you're really clean about this, like you can get really nice, solid designs going, especially like that symmetry point. Maybe I think I had it off there, and you can use brush smoothing if your hand's shaky. Who cares? It's not really a big deal. It just slows you down a little bit, I think. And if you want to adjust that value, I mean, you don't have to have it super smooth, right? You can always go back and, is this cheating? Sure. I don't. You want to call it cheating? Call it cheating. Cheat all day long. It doesn't matter. It really doesn't. You'd be surprised how many pros use brush smoothing and don't show it off usually. It's even more fun because there's a third-party program called Lazy Nizumi that you can use, right? A lot of times this kicks on automatically when you use Photoshop, right? If you have the plugin for it. And I know artists are using it and they don't mention it when they're doing their time-lapse videos or anything like that. They just don't mention it. There's no need to, because a lot of people that are professional artists, they know about things like that, So that little slider in Photoshop that says 0% all the time in those videos, there's a good odd chance they're still using some small amount of brush smoothing, because you can see when I turn this real low, you can't really tell I'm using it, right? It's there, but you just can't tell. And so that's one of those tricks. Or, if you're using like the iPad, right, and Procreate, there's certain art programs when you do a stroke, it like automatically corrects it afterwards, and it just makes it perfect, Procreate's one of those, and Sketchbook used to do it, but I haven't tried Sketchbook since it got bought and was made expensive and stuff. But Sketchbook used to be kind of cool, I thought. But anyways, so have fun with it. Play around with your art tools, guys. Learn to learn some of these techniques that different concept artists use when it comes to rendering, because there's always like value painting, there's line drawing, there's quick sketches to lines, quick sketches to value paints to whatever. I mean, you can work in all kinds of ways. It's up to you to determine which ones work best for you and your style and what you're trying to create, and then put them to work. Some guys go straight to ink. They do everything as like a loose ink sketch, and then they just use it. They might clean it up a little bit or whatever, but some do sketches and then ink it, and then just do the flat shading fills and kind of leave it there, or just quick little brushwork fills and things like that. Yeah, anyways, that's it for this one. I mean, there's been a lot going on. It's kind of been, I've been kind of distracted from those things, plus the computer issues with Windows Update. By the way, the fix for that update issue was to update Windows again with the preview build of the next update, and they fixed it in that apparently. So I don't know how that worked, but system's still goofy right now. So I have trust issues with the system right now, but we'll see what happens. I'll probably just end up formatting again later anyways for the heck of it, but it's usable for now. It's not freezing anymore. And if I get a black screen like I was, well, it doesn't freeze at least, and it goes away. I don't know what the heck's going on with Windows anymore. Yeah, and all the age verification stuff, I guess, is coming, but none of it makes any sense, like how they're trying to implement it. And it's already got like fines and all kinds of other crazy stuff with it. So we'll see what happens in the future here with that. Super exciting. Not. Anyways, enough ranting. I'll see you guys in the next one. Hope you enjoyed. Take care.